3 months after losing everything, Ethan Cole accepted a temporary office job that barely paid enough to cover rent. The company was led by Victoria Hayes, a brilliant CEO known for firing people without a second thought. To everyone else, Ethan was just another disposable temp. But on his third day, while organizing archived financial records no one had touched in years, he discovered a transaction that shouldn't have existed. One missing document led to another, then another. Before long, Ethan uncovered a trail connected to $40 million that had vanished without a trace. And someone inside the company wanted that secret buried forever. Ethan Cole was 38 years old, and by every visible measure, his life had been quietly dismantled. The divorce had come first, 7 years earlier, clean and necessary in the way that painful things sometimes are. He and his ex-wife, Sandra, had parted without bitterness, but also without any illusion that what they had built together could survive the distance that had grown between them, the long hours, the missed dinners, the way he had always placed the work slightly ahead of the life happening around it. They had no children, which made the separation cleaner in some respects and lonelier in others. He had kept the apartment for 2 years after that, then downsized. He had kept his pride for a while longer. Then that too had gone the way of everything else. What remained was a man who understood numbers better than most people understood language, who had spent 15 years building a reputation as a senior financial analyst at Mercer Capital, only to watch that reputation become irrelevant when the firm collapsed following a botched merger that left 300 employees without jobs and one federal investigation that went nowhere. He had been unemployed for 11 months. 11 months of applications, sent to positions he was more than qualified for, of first-round interviews that ended with polite thank you emails, and then silence, of updating his resume so many times that the document had started to feel like a piece of fiction about a person he used to be. He watched his savings account drain the way a bathtub drains after the plug is pulled slowly at first. Then, all at once, he sold 2 suits he no longer needed. He canceled subscriptions one by one. He cooked meals that stretched further than meals were designed to stretch. By the time the staffing agency called with an offer, he had stopped pretending he had options and had started practicing a different skill. The skill of showing up anyway, dressed well, with a firm handshake, on time. The job was a temporary contract at Hayes Global, one of the mid-sized investment holding companies operating out of a glass tower in the financial district. The assignment was simple: assist the administrative team, help organize physical and digital records, fill gaps wherever gaps existed. The pay was modest. The title was nothing, but it covered rent on his studio apartment, and it put food in the refrigerator. And for Ethan Cole in November of that year, that was enough. He dressed carefully on his first morning. He pressed his one remaining good shirt. He arrived 7 minutes early and introduced himself to the front desk with a handshake that was firmer than the moment probably warranted, because he had learned that confidence was a thing you performed until it became real again. The woman at the desk smiled politely and handed him a visitor badge that said Temp in small letters beneath his name. The administrative floor was the kind of place where people who had been there long enough had stopped seeing it clearly. Cubicles lined the east wall. A break room with a coffee machine that needed descaling sat at the far end. The carpet was the particular shade of gray that said we stopped caring about this space years ago. Ethan was given a desk near the supply closet, a computer that took 4 minutes to boot, and a stack of onboarding paperwork that nobody had bothered to personalize. 2 colleagues walked past him that morning without making eye contact. A third glanced at his badge, read the word Temp, and moved on. He understood. He had been on the other side of that glance before, back when he sat in corner offices and approved budgets. He had not been unkind, exactly, but he had not been attentive either. He understood now what invisibility felt like from the inside. It was near the end of that first day, while he was refilling printer paper in the copy room, that he heard 2 administrative assistants talking in lowered voices by the window. One of them, a woman with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, was telling the other about something that had happened years before he arrived. A financial discrepancy. a sum of money that had disappeared from internal accounts and triggered an internal audit that went nowhere. Investigators had reviewed records for months. Nothing solid had ever been found. The company had absorbed the loss, restructured quietly, and moved forward. But the story never fully died. Because $40 million is not a number that people forget easily. Ethan listened without appearing to listen. He stacked the papers slowly. He filed the information in the part of his mind where he kept things that mattered. And he said nothing. Victoria Hayes had built her reputation on two things: results and ruthlessness. She had taken over as CEO of Hayes Global at 34, inheriting a company her father had founded and that her older brother had nearly destroyed through a combination of overconfidence and willful ignorance. She had restructured the executive team within 60 days of taking the position, terminated 4 senior directors whose performance she described in the board meeting as decorative, and returned the company to profitability within 18 months. The financial press admired her. The board respected her in the way that powerful people respect someone they are slightly afraid of. Her employees described her in terms that ranged from demanding to brilliant depending on who was speaking and how recently they had been in a meeting with her. She was not cruel, she was precise. There is a difference, though from the outside, the two can look identical. Victoria did not raise her voice in meetings. She did not need to. She asked questions in a measured tone that made it immediately clear whether the person she was questioning had prepared or had not, and she had no patience for the latter. She worked 12-hour days as a matter of habit, not performance. She kept a standing desk in the corner of her office and never used the chair behind the mahogany table unless she was signing documents. She had been described, in a profile published 2 years earlier, as a woman who treated every conversation like a deposition, listening for inconsistencies, probing for weaknesses, never revealing more than she intended. The journalist had meant it as a mild criticism. Victoria had framed it and hung it on the wall. She was not vain about the description. She simply thought it was accurate and saw no reason to be defensive about accuracy. What Victoria had learned, in 6 years of running the company her family had built, was that most organizational failures are not failures of resources or strategy. They are failures of attention. People stop looking carefully. They accept the summary instead of reading the source. They trust the system because trusting the system is easier than interrogating it. She had built her management style around the refusal to accept the summary. She read primary documents. She asked the people closest to the work what they were seeing. She walked the floors of her buildings on a schedule that no one could predict, because predictability in a leader creates a blind spot that is indistinguishable from trust. She was, by most external assessments, demanding. By her own, she was merely paying attention. She had not paid enough attention to the archive room. She had not paid enough attention to Ethan Cole. These were failures she was still in the process of accounting for when he walked into her office with a manila folder and changed everything. She was not aware of Ethan Cole for the first 2 days. This was not unusual. She was not aware of most of the temporary staff. Her attention was a resource she allocated deliberately, and temporary employees occupied a category that did not yet require it. She knew, in a general sense, that the staffing agency had sent someone to help with records management, because the head of administration had mentioned it in passing. She had acknowledged the information and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Ethan was, in her mental landscape, a placeholder, someone performing a necessary function, briefly, the way a utility performs a function, noticed only when it stops working. What Victoria did know, and what she had been managing with careful precision for 4 months, was the ongoing problem of the $40 million. The company had officially closed that chapter 5 years ago, when the internal audit failed to produce a credible suspect, and the board voted to write off the loss as an unresolved accounting anomaly. But Victoria had never believed the audit. The investigators had been competent, she thought, but they had been looking in the wrong direction. $40 million does not vanish from a company like Hayes Global without help from someone who understands the architecture of the company's financial systems, someone who knew which records were reviewed and which were not. Someone on the inside. She had been quietly rebuilding her own trail of suspicion, document by document, for months. But she was operating alone and carefully, because she did not yet know who she could trust. Ethan was assigned to the archive room on his third day. It was a space that existed at the intersection of neglect and institutional memory, a long, narrow room on the building's lower administrative level, lined with metal shelving units that held labeled boxes in varying states of deterioration. The boxes contained physical records, mostly from the company's earlier years, before the system's migration that had moved everything to digital storage. Some boxes had never been opened since they were first packed. Some were labeled incorrectly. Ethan was given a spreadsheet with a partial index and asked to verify contents, correct the index, and flag anything that appeared out of place. It was, by design, tedious work. He moved through the first 2 rows methodically, the way he had always approached any analytical task, not rushing, not skipping, treating every item as potentially relevant until proven otherwise. He made handwritten notes in the margin of the index printout. He corrected mislabeled boxes with strips of white tape and a marker he had brought from the supply closet. He worked in the particular focused silence of someone who finds the interior of a complicated problem more interesting than the surface of an easy one. There was something in the work that felt familiar in a way that almost nothing else had in the past year, the tactile reality of paper records. The slight give of aging, cardboard, the smell of a room that had been accumulating time for years without anyone paying attention to it. He understood this kind of space. He had spent years navigating the equivalent of it in digital form, the vast, imperfect archives of institutional memory, full of things that had been recorded and then forgotten. It was near the end of his second hour in the room, while cross-referencing a series of quarterly transaction summaries from 6 years prior, that something caught his attention. A transfer record appeared twice. Not identical copies, the dates matched, but the authorization codes were different. A single transaction, processed on a Tuesday in March of that year, had been logged in 2 separate files with 2 separate approval signatures. One of those signatures matched the format used by the Treasury Department. The other used a formatting convention that had been retired from the company's system nearly a decade earlier. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that only a person with 15 years of experience reading financial records would notice. Someone younger would have assumed it was a clerical quirk. Someone without the specific background to recognize the old authorization format would have passed right over it. But Ethan noticed it, the way a person who has spent years reading musical scores notices a note that is technically correct, but somehow wrong for the passage it sits in, the recognition arriving before the analysis, the instinct preceding the understanding. He set the file aside and kept moving. By the end of that day, he had found 3 more inconsistencies. A record that had been replaced by a photocopy, not a scan, a photocopy, with the original nowhere in the surrounding files. A transaction approval that referenced an account number that did not match any account in the index. A quarterly summary that had been amended with a handwritten correction that changed a 6-figure outflow into 2 smaller amounts that, when added together, were deliberately close but not equal to the original. Each discrepancy was small. Together, they were a pattern. And Ethan Cole had spent his entire professional life reading patterns. He said nothing to anyone that evening. He went home, made dinner, and sat at the small table in his apartment thinking through what he had found. He was a temporary employee, with no clearance beyond his basic access, no standing to investigate anything, and no reason anyone would take seriously if he raised a concern. He was the man with Temp on his badge. He was the person other people walked past without making eye contact. He understood all of this, and he also understood that the pattern he had found was not accidental, and that the person who had constructed it had been careful enough to nearly succeed in burying it permanently. Nearly. He returned the next morning and continued. He worked slower, more carefully, photographing records with his personal phone before replacing them in sequence so that nothing appeared disturbed. He cross-referenced transaction dates against the company's publicly available filings from the same period, looking for moments where internal records diverged from what had been reported externally. He found 7. Over 3 days, working during his lunch hour, and staying past his contracted hours by claiming he needed extra time to finish the inventory. He assembled a rough map of what appeared to be a coordinated manipulation of internal transfer records, transactions that had been processed through the company's system, approved by someone with senior authorization access, and then systematically obscured through a combination of duplicate filing, record substitution, and retroactive amendments. The money had not disappeared. It had been moved. And the movement had been designed to look like chaos. The name on the final approval signature in the oldest of the doctored files was not a name Ethan recognized immediately. It was a department code combined with an executive designation that pointed to the position of Senior Director of Treasury Operations. He checked the current company directory. The position still existed. The person currently holding it had been with the company for 9 years. He started noticing things he hadn't noticed before. A document he had left in a specific position was moved. Not by much, just enough that he knew someone else had handled it. His desktop computer showed a login timestamp from a time he had not been in the building. He mentioned the timestamp discrepancy to the IT help desk, framing it as a possible system error, and was told it would be looked into. It was not looked into. 2 days later, a folder he had specifically created on the shared administrative drive, labeled with a generic name, containing copies of the documents he had flagged, was gone. The folder did not appear in the recycle bin. It had been deleted by someone with administrative access to the system. The same afternoon, Victoria Hayes received a brief internal memo from the head of compliance, noting that a temporary employee in records management had been accessing archived files from a period under prior audit review and asking whether this behavior should be flagged for investigation. Victoria read the memo twice. She set it down. She picked it up again. She had not met Ethan Cole. She had no particular reason to believe a temp in the archive room was doing anything other than being overly thorough. But something in the specificity of the complaint, the particular period of time being referenced, the particular department whose files were involved, made her pause. She did not respond to the memo immediately. Ethan arrived at his desk the following morning to find an email in his inbox sent from an address he did not recognize, routed through an external server that stripped identifying information. The message was 4 words followed by a period. It read, "Stop now, or else." He read it 3 times. He closed the email. He sat for a long moment, looking at the gray cubicle partition in front of him. He thought about his savings account. He thought about the studio apartment, and the pressed shirt, and the temp badge. He thought about 15 years of expertise being reduced to a plastic. Then he thought about the pattern he had mapped, and the money that had never actually disappeared, and the person whose approval code appeared at the end of a chain of falsified documents, and he decided that stopping was something he was not going to do. He requested a meeting with the CEO. He went through the proper channel, submitted a formal request through the administrative assistant, stated that he had information relevant to an internal matter, and asked for 30 minutes. He expected to be turned down. He was a temp who had been with the company for less than 2 weeks. He had no formal standing, no title, no relationship with anyone above the administrative level. He was aware of exactly how this looked from the outside. A contract worker with a visitor badge requesting an audience with the chief executive on the basis of an unspecified internal matter. He had drafted the meeting request 4 times before sending it, each time removing language that sounded too urgent or too certain, because he understood that the most dangerous thing he could do was appear either panicked or overconfident. He settled on precise and neutral. He pressed send and went back to his desk. Instead of a rejection, he received a response 2 hours later confirming a meeting the following morning at 8 o'clock. He spent that evening organizing everything he had collected into a coherent sequence, printing copies at the print shop 3 blocks from his apartment because he no longer trusted the office machines, and arriving the next morning 15 minutes early. Victoria Hayes was standing when he entered. She did not invite him to sit immediately. She looked at him with the evaluating directness she brought to every interaction, reading the man in front of her the way she would read a balance sheet scanning for signal in the structure. He was neatly dressed, controlled. He carried a manila folder with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that what was inside it mattered. She gestured to the chair across from her standing desk. He sat. She remained standing. He began without preamble. He told her what he had found, in what order, and what it indicated. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate beyond what the documents supported. He laid the records in sequence on the desk between them. And he walked her through the logic the way he would have walked through an analysis presentation in the years before everything fell apart. She listened without interrupting. Twice, she leaned forward to examine a specific document more closely. Once, she picked up a record and held it under the desk lamp. She did not speak until he was finished. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was how he had recognized the formatting discrepancy in the authorization codes. He explained the historical convention, and when it had been retired from use, her expression shifted, barely perceptibly, in the direction of respect. The second question was why he had continued after receiving the threatening email. He considered the question. Then he told her the truth that he had spent the better part of a year being treated as someone whose expertise had no value, and that he was not willing to walk away from a problem he was qualified to solve simply because someone wanted him to be afraid. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the folder. She said quietly that she needed him to tell no one else about this. He agreed. She said she had been conducting her own parallel review, and that certain elements of what he had brought her confirmed suspicions she had not been able to substantiate independently. He listened. She said that the $40 million had not been stolen in a single transaction. It had been extracted through a series of transfers, each individually small enough to pass standard review thresholds, routed through a sequence of intermediary accounts held by shell companies registered in 3 different jurisdictions. The final destination of the money was an account cluster that had been operationally dissolved years ago, but whose assets had been quietly redistributed before closure. She had tracked the chain to a point where it ended at a name she had not wanted to believe. Ethan took the summary she handed him and read through the transaction map she had constructed. He cross-referenced it against the approval codes in his own records. The name at the end of both trails was the same. It belonged to a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had served on the Hayes Global Board of Directors for 11 years, who sat on the audit committee, and who had been present for every internal investigation into the missing funds. The full picture was worse than either of them had suspected individually. As Ethan and Victoria pooled their findings over the following week, meeting in her office before the rest of the building arrived and after most of it had left, the shape of the fraud became clear in the way that complex things become clear when viewed from the right angle, not all at once, but in stages, each new piece of evidence, shifting the perspective until the whole structure was visible. They spoke quietly and specifically, in the language of documentation and transaction codes, in the particular shorthand of 2 people who both understood the technical architecture of institutional finance. They did not discuss anything beyond the evidence. They did not speculate. They did not speak about what they felt about what they were finding, though both of them felt it. The scheme had been designed with the assumption that no one would ever look carefully enough at the specific combination of records that would reveal it. The archived physical files had been considered safe precisely because no one with the expertise to analyze them had ever been assigned to examine them. The digital system had been altered enough to obscure the original trail. The individuals involved had, over the years, rotated into and out of positions in ways that made it difficult to establish a single clear line of continuous responsibility. Everything had been constructed to look, if ever examined, like a series of administrative errors and system quirks that added up to nothing coordinated. Until now, Gerald Ashworth had not acted alone. The records pointed to a coordinated effort involving 2 additional senior figures. The current Director of Treasury Operations, a man named Raymond Park, whose authorization code appeared repeatedly in the falsified approvals at every critical juncture in the transfer chain, and a former CFO named Diane Stiller, who had resigned unexpectedly 4 years earlier, citing personal reasons, and relocated abroad. Stiller had been present during the original internal audit. She had sat in those meetings with access to every working document the investigators produced. She had known exactly where the investigation was looking and had been positioned to redirect it whenever it came close to the relevant records. The audit had not failed because the investigators were incompetent. It had failed because a person with full visibility into the investigation had been guiding it away from the truth from the inside. The danger of what they were doing was not abstract. Documents were continuing to disappear. The IT department confirmed. When Ethan pressed the issue through a formal help desk ticket, citing a compliance concern, that his workstation had been accessed remotely on 2 occasions by an account with elevated administrative privileges. Someone was monitoring what he was doing. Someone with the technical access and the institutional authority to cover their tracks. Ethan began keeping no records on company systems at all. He worked from handwritten notes in a small notebook he carried on his person. Victoria established a secure encrypted folder on an external cloud server she controlled privately, and they transferred information between themselves through that channel only. The attack came on a Wednesday morning. Ethan arrived to find that his building access card had been deactivated. When he called the security desk, he was told that his contract had been flagged for a policy violation and that HR would be in touch. Within 2 hours, he received a formal notification from the Human Resources Department stating that he was being investigated for unauthorized access to restricted company data and potential misappropriation of confidential financial records. His access to all company systems had been revoked. He was asked to surrender any company property and not return to the building pending review. The accusation was specific, documented, and entirely fabricated, constructed using the same logs that had been generated when his workstation was accessed without his knowledge, now reframed as evidence of his own misconduct. He sat on a bench outside the building in the cold November air and allowed himself, briefly, to feel the weight of what was happening. The accusation was specific, documented, and entirely fabricated, constructed using the same logs that had been generated when his workstation was accessed without his knowledge, now reframed as evidence of his own misconduct. It was a clean move. He could see the logic of it, even as it was being used against him. If you cannot destroy the evidence, destroy the credibility of the person who found it. Make him the story, instead of the fraud. Make him something that needs to be investigated, something suspicious, something the company needs to distance itself from. It was the kind of maneuver that required institutional access and a certain cold ruthlessness to execute quickly, and its speed told him something. Whoever had initiated it had been prepared. They had anticipated the possibility that someone would eventually find what he had found, and they had a response ready to deploy. That meant they had been worried, perhaps for years, about exactly this scenario. He had been here before, in different shapes. The merger that erased his career. The moment he signed the divorce papers. Every interview that ended in silence. He was familiar with the particular gravity of losing something he had worked for. He sat with it for 10 minutes. Then he called Victoria's cell phone, which she had given him the week before. She answered on the second ring. He told her what had happened. There was a silence on the other end, and then she said, with a precision that he had come to recognize as her version of anger, "Don't go anywhere." She went directly to the HR director's office. She did not raise her voice. She told the director, in the measured tone she used when she was not asking for agreement, but stating a position, that the investigation against Ethan Cole would be paused immediately, and that he would retain his contract status pending a review that she would personally oversee. The HR director reminded her that the complaint had been filed through proper channels by a member of the senior leadership team. Victoria looked at the director and said that she was aware of that, and that the filing itself was part of an internal matter she was already investigating at the executive level, and that the appropriate response was to stand down and wait for her guidance. The director stood down. Ethan was reinstated the following morning. He did not return to the archive room. He worked from a private office Victoria had designated for his use, with a secure network connection and door access limited to his card and hers. He was not yet sure what to make of her, this woman who had initially looked through him as though he were furniture, and who now trusted him with information she trusted no one else with. He thought about it sometimes in the evenings, the way circumstances reveal people to each other in ways that normal interaction never does. He had been invisible to her for the first days of his contract, then she had seen him clearly, and had chosen to act on what she saw. There was something in that which mattered to him, though he did not spend too much time trying to name it. The witness appeared on a Thursday evening. Victoria received a message through the encrypted channel from a number she didn't recognize, stating simply that the sender had documentation she needed to see and that they had been waiting for the right moment to come forward for 3 years. She responded carefully. The sender identified themselves as Marcus Webb, a former analyst in the Treasury Department who had resigned 4 years prior under pressure he had never publicly explained. He had kept copies. He had kept them because he had been afraid, and because he had hoped that eventually someone would open the right door. He said that when he learned, through a former colleague, that the archive files were being reviewed again, he had known the moment had arrived. They met him on a Saturday morning at a neutral location, a conference room in a law firm that Victoria used for outside counsel, with her personal attorney present. Marcus Webb was in his early 40s, with the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had grown accustomed to its weight without ever becoming comfortable with it. He was dressed carefully, as though the meeting were a formal occasion, which for him it was. He had been rehearsing what he would say for 3 years. He had rehearsed it in his apartment in the months after his resignation, when the fear of what he knew had been loud enough to interfere with sleep. He had rehearsed it during the years that followed, when the fear had quieted but not disappeared, when he had told himself repeatedly that the moment had passed and that coming forward would only expose him to risk without producing any useful result. He had been wrong about that. He had known he was wrong about it for a long time. He brought a hard drive and a physical binder. The hard drive contained original digital records, pre-manipulation versions of the same files Ethan had found in altered form in the archive room. The binder contained printouts he had made before his resignation, including internal communications that referenced the transfer scheme in language that was oblique enough to be deniable in isolation, but unambiguous when read in the context of what Ethan and Victoria had already assembled. Most critically, the hard drive contained a version of a specific authorization form that showed the original digital signature before it had been altered. The falsified version in the archive had replaced the original signatory with a code that pointed to a now-defunct department account, distributing accountability in a way that made individual responsibility difficult to establish. The original version showed a personal authorization code traceable, specific, belonging to one individual. It belonged to Gerald Ashworth. Ethan spent the weekend reconstructing the complete timeline. He worked methodically, building a document that traced each transaction from initiation to final destination, cross-referenced against the authorization records, the pre-manipulation originals provided by Marcus Webb, and the external banking records that Victoria had obtained through the company's legal counsel under a confidential subpoena she had arranged without informing the board. When he was finished, the document was 43 pages long. Every claim was sourced. Every source was verified against at least one independent record. There were no gaps he could not account for, and no conclusions he had stated that the evidence did not directly support. He read it through twice. He sent it to Victoria's encrypted folder. She read it through twice. Then she called an emergency session of the board of directors for the following Tuesday, citing an urgent matter of fiduciary concern, requiring immediate attention. Gerald Ashworth arrived at the boardroom with the comfortable authority of a man who had occupied that room for more than a decade. He took his usual seat, arranged his papers, and greeted the other members with the measured pleasantries of someone who had no reason to be concerned. The director of Treasury Operations arrived separately and sat at the far end of the table. Victoria waited until everyone was seated. Then she asked Ethan to present. He stood at the head of the table and he was, in that moment, something other than what anyone in the room had expected. He was not the temporary employee from the archive room. He was not the man with the Temp badge and the computer that took 4 minutes to boot. He was a financial analyst with 15 years of expertise, presenting the findings of an investigation that had taken him 6 weeks to construct, and every person in the room understood within the first 3 minutes that what they were hearing was not speculation. The numbers were exact. The documentation was complete. The chain of authorization was unambiguous. He had the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time waiting for a task that matched their capabilities, and who is now, finally, doing it. There is a quality to that kind of presence, a groundedness that has nothing to do with ego and everything to do with competence, and the people in the room felt it, even the ones who were afraid of what it meant. He presented without drama. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He let the figures speak in the way that figures, when they are true, always eventually do. He showed the original records alongside the falsified versions. He showed the shell company registrations and their operational timelines. He showed the banking records and the flow of funds through each intermediary account. He showed Marcus Webb's original documentation, now formally authenticated, alongside the altered versions that had been substituted in the archive. And at the end, he showed the original authorization form, the one with Gerald Ashworth's personal code, alongside the manipulated version that had replaced it. He placed the two documents side by side on the table and invited anyone present to identify a discrepancy in his analysis. No one spoke. The room was quiet. 3 members of the board, who had not been involved, and who were hearing this information for the first time, sat very still. One of them, a woman who had been on the audit committee when the original investigation was conducted, had the expression of someone who had just understood something that reframed everything they thought they knew. Gerald Ashworth said nothing for a long moment. Then he said the documents had been taken out of context. Then he said the chain of custody for the original files could not be established. His attorney, who was seated beside him, leaned over and said something quietly in his ear. Ashworth stopped talking. Victoria spoke after Ethan finished. She spoke to the full board, not to Ashworth specifically, in the tone she used when she was done negotiating and ready to act. She told them that the documentation had been provided to the company's outside legal counsel the previous Friday. She told them that a formal report had been filed with the relevant regulatory authority that same afternoon. She told them that the company's banking partners had been placed on formal notification, and she told them that the path forward, in her assessment, was full cooperation with the investigation, immediate suspension of the individuals named in the documentation pending external review, and a complete voluntary disclosure to the market. Several members of the board pushed back. The word they used was exposure. They were concerned about what a public disclosure would do to the company's stock price, its banking relationships, its market position. Victoria listened to all of it. Then she said that she understood those concerns, and that she had already modeled the projected impact of voluntary disclosure against the projected impact of the disclosure being forced through regulatory action, and that the numbers favored transparency by a significant margin. She said the company's value was ultimately a function of its credibility, and that its credibility required that this be handled correctly. She said she was not asking for a vote on whether to act. She was informing them that she had already acted, and that their choice was how to align with that decision. Gerald Ashworth was escorted from the boardroom by building security before the session ended, at the instruction of the company's legal counsel. The Director of Treasury Operations resigned by the end of the day. The former CFO, who was reached through international legal channels, retained counsel within 48 hours. The regulatory investigation that followed took 7 months. It resulted in criminal charges against all 3 individuals. The banking records Ethan and Victoria had assembled formed the documentary core of the prosecution's case. The recovered funds, when the process of tracing and clawing back the transferred assets was complete, amounted to approximately $31 million, not the full 40, but more than anyone had believed recoverable when the loss was first acknowledged 5 years earlier. The company survived. It did more than survive. Victoria's decision to get ahead of the disclosure, to approach the regulatory body voluntarily, and to cooperate fully from the beginning, positioned Hayes Global in a way that the markets responded to with cautious respect rather than panic. The initial dip in share price stabilized within 3 weeks. The company's outside counsel released a statement that was notable for its specificity and its absence of defensiveness. A statement that named the wrongdoing, described the mechanism by which it had been discovered, and outlined the steps being taken to ensure it could not happen again. Several institutional investors who had been watching the company's governance practices from a distance indicated, through their analysts, that the handling of the situation had increased rather than decreased their confidence in the leadership. The board, chastened and reconfigured, appointed 2 new independent directors with direct experience in financial compliance oversight. The story, when it became public, was not the story of a company that had been defrauded. It was the story of a company that had found the fraud, pursued it without flinching, and made it right. That is a different story. That story has a future. The regulatory investigation that followed took 7 months. It resulted in criminal charges against all 3 individuals. Gerald Ashworth's trial, when it came, drew attention from the financial press not only for the scale of the misconduct, but for the paper trail that had unraveled it. A trail that had been invisible for 5 years until a temporary employee with no clearance, no authority, and no obvious reason to care had walked into an archive room and started reading. The banking records Ethan and Victoria had assembled formed the documentary core of the prosecution's case. The recovered funds, when the process of tracing and clawing back the transferred assets was complete, amounted to approximately $31 million, not the full 40, but more than anyone had believed recoverable when the loss was first acknowledged 5 years earlier. The company's auditors noted, in their subsequent report, that the recovery had been made possible by the preservation of physical records that a fully digitized archive would not have retained. Paper, it turned out, is harder to delete than data. He had said nothing about it to Victoria. He was not certain what he was expecting. He had done what he came to do, in the most unexpected way possible. And he understood that outcomes of that kind do not always translate into the forms of recognition that match their weight. He was prepared, if necessary, to return to the staffing agency, to accept another contract somewhere else, to begin again in the small ways that he had become practiced at. He was not untouched by what had happened. The preceding 6 weeks had reminded him of things he had set aside, capacities he had allowed himself to believe were no longer relevant. But he was also realistic. He had learned not to build expectations out of gratitude. Victoria called him into her office on the Thursday, before his contract was scheduled to end. She was seated behind the mahogany desk, which he had rarely seen her use, and there was a document on the table in front of her. The office was quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved at its usual pace, indifferent and continuous, the way cities always are regardless of what is happening inside the buildings that define their skyline. Victoria had been in this office for 6 years. She had made hundreds of decisions from behind or in front of that desk, decisions about people, about capital, about the direction of a company that bore her family's name. She was not sentimental about any of it, but she was aware, as she waited for Ethan to sit down, that the decision she was about to present was different from most of the ones she had made in this room. Not larger, necessarily, but more honest. She waited until he had sat down. She said that she owed him an acknowledgement that was overdue. She said that she had spent the first days of his contract not seeing him, and that this was a failure she intended to examine carefully, because the failure had nearly cost the company the one person who had the skill and the judgment to do what needed to be done. She said this without self-pity and without excessive apology, in the direct way that was characteristic of everything she said. He listened without interrupting. Then she turned the document on the desk so that he could read it. It was a formal offer of employment, full-time, permanent, at the level of Director of Risk Control, a position that had not existed at Hayes Global before that week, that had been designed specifically around the gap the preceding months had made visible. The salary was more than he had earned at Mercer Capital, at the peak of his career there. The scope of the role encompassed exactly the kind of analytical oversight that his experience made him uniquely qualified to provide. He read through the document carefully, because he was a person who read things carefully. He asked 2 questions about the terms. She answered both of them without hesitation. He looked up from the document. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something quieter than her usual precision, something that acknowledged the unusual nature of what had passed between them over the past weeks. She had not planned to feel anything in particular about this moment. She had planned to make the offer, answer questions, and close the meeting with the efficiency that characterized every other interaction she had in this room. But she found that she was aware of what this moment represented not just for the company, but for him. For the version of him that had walked through the front door 6 weeks ago with a visitor badge that said Temp and a pressed shirt and the dignified composure of someone performing a form of quiet courage that most people in the building would never have recognized because they had never had occasion to need it. She said, "You walked in here as a temp." He looked at the contract. He thought about the archive room and the mismatched authorization codes and the threatening email and the morning he had sat on the bench outside in the cold. He thought about 11 months of silence from job applications he had believed in. He thought about the temp badge in a drawer somewhere, already obsolete. He thought about the particular loneliness of being skilled at something in a world that has temporarily stopped having a place for that skill, the way that kind of loneliness is different from ordinary loneliness, because it carries with it a doubt that goes deeper than circumstance. The doubt that says, maybe I was wrong about what I was worth. He had carried that doubt for almost a year. He did not carry it now. She said, "But you saved this company." He picked up the pen that was resting beside the document. He did not say anything immediately. He thought about what it meant that the work had never changed, that the same expertise, the same trained eye, the same willingness to follow a problem wherever it led, had been there throughout the year of unemployment and the months of invisibility and the morning of the false accusation. He had not been diminished by any of it. He had been waiting, the way precise instruments wait for the right conditions, for the right task, for someone willing to look closely enough to see what was there. He signed the document. The person who had been most easily replaced had turned out to be the one who could not be replaced at all. Some truths take time to become visible, but they do not stop being true while they wait.